And one of the big differences between what Ukraine can do and what the Russians can do is that Ukraine, with Western technology, they can hit moving targets. The Russians find it very hard to hit moving targets. It sounds funny when you say it, but to actually hit a moving target, a convoy or a train that you know has got something important on it, first of all, you've got to spot it, you've got to track it, you've got to get that information back to the control center. The control center's then got to send something off to actually target it. And the Russians are hopeless at doing this. They're way, way behind time. Whereas the Ukrainians have learned how to do this in a matter of a few minutes, the Russians take an hour or so to do it. And by then, of course, the target has gone somewhere else. So this inability of the Russians to hit mobile targets is a real problem for them. And Ukraine's ability to do it means that as the Russians respond to a breakthrough, they could lose a great deal of equipment and men before they even reach the battlefield.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Timesradio with me, Kate Chabot. This time we're talking about the war in Ukraine with Professor of Defence Studies Michael Clarke. Many developments to consider and questions to ask. Is the Ukrainian counteroffensive already underway? What difference will the new weapons like Storm Shadow missiles make? And how long will Ukraine wait for the fighter jets it so badly wants? Professor Michael Clarke is a former Director General of RUSI and is a leading figure in defence and security analysis. He's a specialist advisor to the Joint Committee on National Security Strategy in Parliament, having previously served with both the Defence and the Foreign Affairs Committees. He's a visiting professor at King's College London, where he was the founding director of its Centre for Defence Studies. Mike, welcome to Frontline. Really good to have you here. You've become extremely familiar to everyone for your insight into the war in Ukraine. Can you just start by giving us your overview of what stage you think we're at in the war?
I think we're probably at a third stage in the war. The first stage, February last year, 2022, was when the Russians invaded, and we wondered how long it would be before they occupied at least the eastern third of the country, if not the whole country, and the Ukrainians fought back, and we thought they were losing magnificently. They were losing slowly and magnificently, and very bravely. And that was phase one, and that ran for a little while until about July. And then I think phase two of the war was from about last July until a couple of months ago, say until about February or March this year, when the Ukrainians were clearly able to push the Russians back. And so we saw the offensives in the Kharkiv region and then in Kherson. And the Ukrainians recovered two big swathes of territory, as well as conducting some local counteroffensives. And now we're in phase three, where the Ukrainians are trying to prove to us, the West, and to themselves that they can not only fight the Russians to a standstill. They've proved they can do that, and they can do that more or less anywhere in Ukraine. They can fight them to a standstill, but can they throw the Russians out? And so we're now in phase three with this big counteroffensive, which the Ukrainians are launching now. They're in the process of working it through, I think, in the very early stages of we're seeing it, where they're trying to convince us that actually they can recover most of the territory, if not all of the territory, that was taken from them in February last year, and maybe even some of the territory that was taken from them in 2014. So I think we're at the beginning of what I would call phase three of the war, and there'll be a few more phases yet before this is all done.
Yes, as you say, phase three of the war, the counter-offensive, you say, has begun. What is the strategy, do you think?
Well, we don't know where the Ukrainians will choose to hit the Russians. We know they've got the equipment, or a lot of the equipment that they were promised, not as much as they want, inevitably, but a lot of what they were promised. NATO said they've got more than 95% of everything that they were promised. But having the equipment there is not the same as having it ready and integrated together with armored vehicles, tanks, infantry, artillery, and air defense, and all the things that have got to go together. But essentially, the Ukrainians are choosing now where to try to punch through Russian lines. And if you look at what they've got for this offensive, I mean, most of us know that they've got 9 new brigades, at least 3 of them are fairly heavily armored. And they can probably put another 3 to 5 brigades together of brigades which we know have performed very well and have had a little bit of rest. And then there's a force behind that. But if you put together, say, something between 12 and 16 brigades, fighting brigades, for the spearhead of this offensive, any military professional in Britain or America will tell you that's only about 50 kilometers of front. So you could cover about 50 kilometers and you could punch through anything across that 50 kilometers probably. But the whole front is almost 1,000 kilometers. So which 50 kilometers would you choose to punch through, and to what effect? And that's the big question now, which we're all waiting to see how the Ukrainians play that. Maybe it won't be one thrust, maybe it'll be two or three thrusts. I'm sure that it would be there'll be a lot of deception. What we've seen so far, I'm sure, will not be the direction of the final offensive as it develops. Maybe it will be, but it partly depends on what the Russians themselves do. You know, there's always this phrase that the enemy always has a vote. And what the Ukrainians will be trying to do is to provoke the Russians into casting their vote, which means committing their reserves or committing some of their reserves so as to leave gaps elsewhere. And the Ukrainians will then try to, as it were, play that game, that cat and mouse game, to find a way of breaking through that does them some political good.
And as you say, this is 960 kilometres long, the front line. There are various options, as you say, where they can punch through. Do you have a theory as to where they will try?
Well, I can tell you where the Russians think they'll punch through, and that is in the south. They think that they will push through from Zaporizhia through to Melitopol and to the coast to break the land bridge and isolate Crimea, which would be strategically, a very sensible thing for the Ukrainians to do. And the reason I know the Russians think that is because you've only got to look at their defense. You look at where they've dug most of their defenses, their trenches, their minefields, their tank traps, their dragon's teeth defenses. All these can be seen by satellite photography. And I've seen lots of maps now seen maps every few days of how the defences are progressing. And the more time they're given, the more the Russians build up defences there in the south. So they obviously feel that the Ukrainian offensive is likely to push directly south from Zaporizhia. And indeed, the Russians have started to evacuate civilians, whether they like it or not, from Zaporizhia itself. And they've prepared for a rapid withdrawal from the eastern bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson, in order to, I think, to pull back troops so they can concentrate them at a place of where they think the breakthrough would be in the south. So that's what the Russians clearly seem to anticipate. Of course, if that's what the Russians anticipate, the Ukrainians would be very sensible to do something else. But it may be that ultimately the prize here for the Ukrainians is not so much to take back the Donbass, though that would be a pretty big prize, but actually to break through the middle of Russian lines, and literally, if they could push through to the coast very quickly, with all of the problems that will pose, they could actually have quite a lot of Russian troops the wrong side of the line. They could encircle a lot of Russian troops who would be to the west of them, and they could really threaten Crimea, because putting Crimea under threat is probably the biggest political bargaining chip that the Ukrainians can actually get. Because if Crimea is under threat, then Putin himself is in big trouble politically, as well as the Russians being in trouble militarily.
And how does what is happening at the moment in Bakhmut fit into the bigger picture in terms of the Ukrainians having ground a small amount of land there and starting to encircle the city?
Yes, I think what's happening in Bakhmut is very interesting. As I say, I'd be surprised if this was the beginning of the main thrust. But opportunity might present itself for the Ukrainians to make that the main thrust, and they may go for it. But I think what they're really doing in Bakhmut is trying to make sure that Bakhmut doesn't actually fall, because after all this time, it was literally the 17th of May last year. So to the day, it is a year since the first Russian artillery shells, fell on Bakhmut. So as of today, Bakhmut has been under attack for one complete calendar year. And when we're this close to the offensive, I think the Ukrainians don't want to lose Bakhmut, even though it's strategically not very important, but they don't want the symbolism of losing it. And although they're only hanging on now, I know, to the southwestern corner of the city, they've even lost the northwestern corner now. They're hanging on by their fingertips to the southwestern corner, but they've kept the road open, the famous T0504, which is the route from that tip of Bakhmut out down to Chazhiv Yar, and then Constantinka, which is their escape routes to the southwest. As long as they've kept that road open, then they don't have to admit that they've really lost Bakhmut. And by attacking north and south of the city now and putting the Russians under pressure, they can take some of the pressure off having to, as it were, leave Bakhmut. But Bakhmut is all about symbolism. If they can just hold on until the offensive really starts, they'll never have to say that they've lost it, and therefore not give the Russians the satisfaction of having taken it, and therefore not give themselves the political problem of having to explain after so many deaths why they've lost it. So Bakhmut is the Ukrainians have said this themselves. They said this is the prelude. That's the word they used in English translation. The prelude to the offensive is to save Bakhmut. And it's purely symbolic. And I don't mean that in any disrespect to any of the soldiers who've died there on both sides. It is purely symbolic because the Prigozhin, the Wagner group led by Prigozhin, decided to make it an objective. And because they started a year ago to attack Bakhmut, so the Ukrainians are desperate to save it, if only to prevent the Russians having that satisfaction of taking it.
And we've seen President Zelensky on a charm offensive this week for support, and we've seen the news of the provision of the Storm Shadow long-range missiles by the UK to Ukraine, with more missiles and attack drones to follow. What difference do you think that will really make to what Ukraine can do on the battlefield?
In principle, Storm Shadow makes a big difference because Storm Shadow is a very accurate cruise missile. It's accurate, it's fast, flies about 600 miles an hour, it flies low. It's quite hard to detect. It's got a very small radar signature. And if it's used, as it seems to have been used last week, in conjunction with what the Americans call the MALD, which is the Miniature Air Delivered Decoy Missile, MALD. And the MALD is a missile, but there's no explosives in it. It is literally, it's a decoy which can make itself look like 3 or 4 different aircraft all going in different directions, or it can make itself look like 3 or 4 missiles all heading in different directions, and it carries a suite of electronic countermeasures. So a MALD can actually cut a swathe through Russian defenses electronically, through which Storm Shadow can go through and do its job. Now, if the Ukrainians have got enough Storm Shadows, and we don't know how many they've got, but if they've got enough, they can have a big effect, a really big effect on all of the ammunition stocks and the fuel supplies that the Russians are using. If the Ukrainians know where they are, they've now got a very good chance of being able to hit them, even not just 50 miles behind the lines, which is what they were able to do with the HIMARS, the multiple launch rocket system that they got from the Americans. They can now go 150 miles behind the lines, which will really be a problem for the Russians. And Russian commanders and in the Kremlin, they're saying, oh, Storm Shadow doesn't make any difference. Believe me, they're very worried by this. They are really worried by it. And so the big question is for the Ukrainians, would it be nothing is actually a game changer as such, but would it be a significant advantage? Yes, it would be if they've got enough. And how many have they got? Don't know. But as a guide, Britain
how many do they need?
Yes, well, hundreds, literally hundreds. I mean, we have something between 700 and 1,000 of them. That's our stock. If we were prepared to give them the whole stock, and I personally think we should, because as somebody said, they're no use sitting on the shelf in Britain, let them be used in something that matters to Britain. I mean, give them the whole stock for now. If they had, say, 600 or 700, they would make a big, big difference in actually slowing down the ability of the Russians to get to the front lines. So as and when Ukrainian troops start to make a breakthrough, they can prevent Russian reinforcements getting there. They can stop the fuel, they can stop the ammunition, because even if the Russians have got these things hidden in deep rear areas, at some point, if they're combating a breakthrough, they've got to bring it forward. They've got to bring their ammunition forward on trains or trucks, on roads, or they've got to bring their fuel forward in pipelines or tankers. They can be seen. If they can be seen, they can be hit. And one of the big differences between what Ukraine can do and what the Russians can do is that Ukraine, with Western technology, they can hit moving targets. The Russians find it very hard to hit moving targets. It sounds funny when you say it, but to actually hit a moving target, a convoy or a train that has got something important on it, first of all, you've got to spot it, you've got to track it, you've got to get that information back to the control center. The control center's then got to send something off to actually target it. And the Russians are hopeless at doing this. They're way, way behind time. Whereas the Ukrainians have learned how to do this in a matter of a few minutes, the Russians take an hour or so to do it. And by then, of course, the target has gone somewhere else. So this inability of the Russians to hit mobile targets is a real problem for them. And Ukraine's ability to do it means that as the Russians respond to a breakthrough, they could lose a great deal of equipment and men before they even reach the battlefield.
Of course, Mike, the hope would be that other nations would follow suit like they did with the provision of tanks. How likely is it the US will now supply ATACMS long-range guided missiles so desired by Ukraine?
Well, I think it makes it more likely. I mean, actually, some of us have suspected for a while that maybe the Ukrainians have already got some ATACMS, because this is the Army Tactical Missile System, which is a long-range ground-to-ground system. Because unless the Ukrainians had some ATACMS missiles, we can't really see how they could have attacked targets in Crimea that we know they have already attacked. And in particular, the Kerch Bridge. I don't believe the Kerch Bridge was attacked by a truck bomb because of the way the explosion worked. And when America has been out, the Pentagon's been asked about ATACMS, they've neither confirmed nor denied. Officially, nobody's announced that any of these missiles have been given to Ukraine. But I have long suspected that maybe a handful of them were. But that's an aside,
They
really.
just want more.
Yeah, they will need more. They need more of everything. And the fact that they've now got Storm Shadow, and that Storm Shadow can work so well, and obviously it's aircraft launched Storm Shadow, which gives it more flexibility and greater range because you've got the range of the aircraft as well as the missile itself. But the ATACMS are very good, and they're so accurate, and they're very destructive. And I think it's more likely now that we've crossed this threshold now of long-range missiles. So I think that the threshold now of long-range missiles of the ATACMS type is much more likely to be crossed. And the Ukrainians have got to keep demonstrating to the West that they mean what they say, that they will not use these systems, these Western systems, to attack Russia directly. And I'm convinced that we can believe that, because they know that if they did use any of these systems to attack Russia directly, the West would stop supporting Ukraine because it would just be too dangerous. And if the West stops supporting Ukraine, they lose the war. So it seems to me a simple sort of, 2 + 2 = 4. If they give us their assurances that they will only use these systems inside Ukraine, we can believe those assurances, because it would be criminally stupid of them to do anything else. And I think that what we've seen in this contest from the very beginning is the West keeps establishing not red lines but thresholds that we don't want to cross, and then we cross them, and we cross one threshold after another. And so the next threshold, of course, is fighter jets, and I'm sure we're going to cross that threshold probably sooner rather than later. And what the Ukrainians keep saying is that, if you'd only considered these thresholds all in one go 6 or 8 months ago, we'd all be in a better position than we are now. But we are where we are. So we've crossed the long range missile threshold, and I think the Ukrainians will be given, I'm guessing, but they will now explicitly be given more, the more that they will need in order to counteract Russia's response to their counteroffensive when it really gets underway.
Since you mentioned the fighter jets, we know that Zelensky really wants them, and its F-16s are the most likely ones to be delivered as part of this jets coalition of nations. The UK will supply training. How will they do that, as the UK doesn't even have F-16s?
No, there's two things the United Kingdom will probably do, almost certainly do. I mean, one is basic pilot training for people who are not pilots already or not military pilots already. So basic training can be conducted in all sorts of aircraft, because you're just basically teaching somebody airmanship or airwomanship, whatever it is. And then the second sort is simulation training. Britain is very good at simulated training for pilots. And you can simulate F-16 training, although we don't operate F-16s, we operate Typhoons and F-35s. But you can simply put an F-16 package into the simulator and use that simulator to train for F-16 pilots. So I think we'll do two things. One is basic training, and then simulator training. And again, even simulator training in a Typhoon is depending on what you're training for, whether it's night operations or a certain sort of targeting or air-ground cooperation. What sort of aircraft you're in doesn't matter for certain sorts of training that you might do, basic navigation training, whatever it is. But in this, we should also notice the fact that if the Ukrainians want jets soon, which they do, of course, they need to send their qualified pilots for conversion to the F-16, which means simulators and actually training on the F-16s themselves in the United States. If you're training basic people, basic entrants who are not pilots already, then that really is a longer process. I mean, that's 18 months to 2 years to train them up to a reasonable level, and that's much longer. A much longer horizon. But there's a big argument about, well, how long does it take a combat pilot now, somebody who has been flying MiG-20, MiG-29s or Su-24s, Su-25s? These people have already been in combat. They've got more war experience than our own pilots, than most American pilots. Put them in an F-16, they'll pick it up within a couple of months. Never mind this 6 or 8 months conversion. These people are highly motivated. They're already combat pilots. The general view is they will actually convert really quickly if you put them in real F-16s somewhere in Arizona. And there's a big argument over that. We haven't done it yet, but I'm sure that is the next stage.
Can Ukraine, in your opinion, actually make the territorial gains it needs to make, though, without that air power?
Ukraine can make very significant gains, I think, with what it's got now, which is air defense. And so the most important thing in any land battle is that the sky above the land battle is not owned by the opposition. So, at least it's contested, if not, it belongs to you. And if the Russians obviously will try to conduct a big air campaign against whatever the Ukrainians are doing on the ground, if the Ukrainians can hold them off with ground-based air defense, GBAD as it's known, GBAD, ground-based air defense. If they can hold them off with that, then that for the immediate future is good enough. But the question is, ground-based air defense is the only thing. If that's all you've got no fallback. The best sort of defense is a layered defense. And so what you ideally want is aircraft in the air, missiles firing from a distance, and then ground-based air defense, point defense above the units that are fighting on the ground, so that any opposition has got to come through 2 or 3 layers of defense. If you rely entirely on ground-based air defense, then you've only got one layer. And although it seems to be performing pretty well at the moment, the Russians obviously have been conducting a sort of campaign to exhaust it. They're throwing these Shahed 136 Iranian drones, which are really not very effective anymore. They weren't very effective at the very beginning. But if it takes a missile to bring each one of them down, and these Shahed drones only cost less than $20,000 each, so you're actually exhausting the other side's supply of missiles with a very cheap drone. And so in a way, the Russians don't mind how many Shaheds come down as long as they keep exhausting Ukrainian weapon stocks. And that's the problem which the Ukrainians have got. So ideally, they need aircraft as well, particularly because the Russians have developed this glide bomb now. And this glide bomb is a bog standard bomb. They've got lots of them. They're very cheap. And they found a way, inventive as they are, of putting wings on it, fins on it, and a guidance system based on the GLONASS system, which is like the GPS. It's the Russian version of GPS. And so if an aircraft that would normally drop this bomb, it just falls from the aircraft, it's a gravity bomb. But if it drops the bomb from high enough up, then that bomb is now capable of gliding for 40 kilometers. And it can land very accurately. And that glide bomb is playing havoc at the moment with Ukrainian artillery, because it turns out to be accurate enough, and the Russians have got lots of them. And once this bomb is set off, it's almost impossible to bring it down, because, again, using a very expensive missile against it, you'll run out of good missiles, and you can't really use your anti-aircraft artillery against it. And so the only way to combat this glide bomb, which can be launched from either inside Russian airspace or just not far over the border, means that Russian aircraft don't have to take much of a chance if they can drop a bomb 40 kilometers away from where it's going to land. And the only way the Ukrainians say that they can combat this is aircraft to aircraft. And that's one of the points that we believe that Zelensky has been making in Europe this last week. He's saying, we have to be able to take on the aircraft for aircraft combat in order to stop them dropping glide bombs from 40 and 50 kilometers away in ways that we can't do anything about, because it is playing havoc at the moment with our frontline forces. And that's true. That is demonstrably true in the Donbass, where Russian aircraft would just pop over the border, release a couple of glide bombs, pop back again. They're completely safe, and there's almost nothing the Ukrainians can do. And these are big explosions which are accurately targeted. So the Russians have got themselves a very good weapon here in this glide bomb, and it's only come onto the battlefield in the last 6 weeks.
And if we just turn our attention to the bombardment of Kyiv this week, we saw Russian forces launch a barrage of 18 mass missiles on the capital, all of which Ukraine says were shot down. Are Ukrainian forces actually becoming more successful at defending their skies by using the equipment they've been given?
Yes, they are becoming more effective. I mean, partly because their own command and control is now very sophisticated, very good. But of course, they're effective because they've got some of the best Western systems. So they've got these very good German systems, anti-aircraft systems, and most important of all, they've now got Patriot batteries. And the Patriot, the American system, which is also operated in Poland, for instance, is the best in the world. Patriot is the best system in the world. It will bring down pretty well anything. Certainly, it'll bring down missiles. It'll certainly bring down aircraft, bring down drones. The problem with Patriot is that it's so very expensive, and so every Patriot battery costs about $1 billion, and about $400 million is the cost of the battery, and about $600 million, about 2/3 of it, is the cost of the missiles. And so you only use Patriot batteries to bring down some high value targets. Again, it's stupid to use Patriot missiles against cheap Shahed drones. You need them against ballistic missiles, the Kinzhal missiles or the Dagger missiles, which the Russians, these hypersonic missiles, which apparently the Russians have been throwing at Kiev, and which they thought were absolutely incapable of stopping. And it looks as if Patriots in the last 48 hours have had their first victories against Russia's hypersonic missiles, as far as we can tell. Although, of course, when a missile is destroyed in midair, it's going to fall somewhere, and the debris has done a certain amount of damage. But it's a great deal better to have a missile destroyed in midair 50 miles away from where it's due to land, and even though the debris itself may cause death and injury. And so, yes, the Ukrainians are doing very well, but they're doing it partly because of the systems they've got. And again, the argument is that the Russians will keep on doing this. They'll just throw as many cheap systems or cheap missiles and drones at the Ukrainian defense system as they can, hoping to exhaust it, at least in the short term, to create some holes through which they can send some of their big missiles. But I have to say, at the moment, I would not have expected the Ukrainians to do this well in their air defense. And the last few days have been very encouraging. Whether it's just a fluke, I don't know. But I guess we're going to find out in the next month whether they can keep up this very high rate of interception. I mean, it's been over 80% since the Russian offensive began. The Russian offensive began last October, on October the 10th, to be precise. And the Russians have launched now 16 major strikes against Ukraine. And the 16th strike has been over a week long. Most of them were 24 hours strikes. They were over one period. And this 16th strike, because I keep logging them, and the 16th strike has been over more than a week now. So it's a more consistent bombardment. And the Ukrainians have done really well. They've done really well because their interception rates are now well over 94, 95%. If they can keep that up, then they can weather the aerial assault which Russia has launched on Ukrainian society in general.
It's been suggested that the Russian air defense systems have a software and radar problem. We've seen reports and footage of Russian aircraft being shot down inside Russia. How significant is the risk posed by the problems of identifying friend or foe?
Yeah, the old IFF problem, identification friend or foe, is it's been a problem since the beginning of air power, really, going back to the First World War, because there are different aircraft do different jobs. And for all sorts of organizational reasons, very often a force doesn't know how many of its own aircraft are in the air, because it might have transport aircraft in the air doing one job. It might have executive jets flying generals backwards and forwards. It might have fighters, bombers, electronic countermeasure aircraft, and so on. And what the Russians are not very good at doing, because they've never had to do it before, is what in NATO is always known as AWACS, the Airborne Warning and Control System. And AWACS is we know, we've seen it all the time, where an aircraft or two or three aircraft can circle around an area, and they're almost like an aerial control tower. They can see everything that's going on, and they can organize the airspace. Now, again, I mean, Russia's got that capability, but they've never really exercised it, and they've never had to do it as far as we know anyway, in an alliance context. And so, whereas in NATO, it's absolutely standard that were, NATO was working with sometimes with 5 or 8 or even 14 different nations, all with air power, as it were, in Northern Europe or over the Mediterranean in these great big exercises. Very complex. I mean, no sort of air power in the world so far has ever been as complex and so far as successful as NATO in organizing all of this. Whereas the Russians themselves, even though they've only got themselves to worry about and don't operate in big coalitions like this, because they organize themselves in stovepipes, they're all in silos, they seem to have made hard work of the problem of coordination. And we see this at all levels. I mean, the Russian military machinery, we haven't seen much of. We've seen a bit of the Navy, but not very much in this war, but certainly quite a lot of the Army, quite a lot of the Air Force. Their military machinery is so organizationally poor that in a way it's not surprising that they've had some IFF incidents, or blue on blue, friendly fire, whatever you want to call it. We can't be sure that they're shooting their own aircraft down by mistake, or they're competing with each other. But we can't be sure it isn't Ukrainian sabotage or somebody's sabotage. But certainly they've had a number of incidents which have brought down their own aircraft and a lot of their own drones. And again, if I was a Russian senior military officer, I'd be looking very, very hard at what's been going wrong.
If we pull back and look at the bigger picture, some analysts are of the view that Vladimir Putin wants a forever war. All he has to do is hang on until the power supplying Ukraine run out of the weapons or the resolve to carry on. How likely is that, do you think, to happen?
It's absolutely the case, I'm sure, that Putin does want a forever war. It's not what he intended, but he's riding a tiger now. It's, if you get onto the back of a tiger, then you've got to stay on the tiger. You've just got to stay there for the ride, wherever it takes you. If you get off, the tiger will kill you. The tiger will eat you. So he's on a tiger's back, and he's got no choice but to keep on. And he's past the point of no return, some considerable time ago, I think. And I'm sure he doesn't exactly know what he wants to happen next. I mean, he's hoping that lots of things may happen, that the West may simply go soft on the war and decide that they can't back Ukraine any longer. That's entirely plausible. I think he's hoping for a right-wing Republican victory in the United States at the November next year, which would change the political character of Western involvement. And that's, again, plausible. I don't think it's all that likely, but it is plausible. And I think he's hoping for some sort of military breakthrough that would make a difference and push the Ukrainians to the negotiating table, where they agree to give even more of their territory than they were forced to give in 2014. But I'm sure that, like all dictators and autocrats, he believes in his own mind, he thinks he's good in a crisis. Usually these people are not good in a crisis, but they think they are. And so he believes that as the war goes on, more crises will emerge, and that he, because he's cunning and clever, in his view, because he can move more quickly than his opponents, and that is true, dictators can always make things happen more quickly than democracies can, that he'll be able to, as it were, stay in control of the situation. He's not sure how this will work out, but he believes in himself that he'll be able to manufacture something out of this, which will get him off the hook and give him the victory that he wants, to make him look like Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and Joseph Stalin.
So when you say he's past the point of no return, but he does want to push the Ukrainians to the negotiating table, do you think there is still a diplomatic solution to this war?
There is only a diplomatic solution to the war if the Russians are thrown out of all of the territory that they've taken since 2022. I think and in that case, Putin's invasion will have been seen to fail, and he will have paid a very heavy price for that failure. Anything short of that, I don't think would be a diplomatic solution acceptable to Ukraine. And unless Zelensky, who, after all, I mean, he does face elections himself next year, but if Zelensky's, he's very, very popular at the moment, but of course that can change. But if Zelensky's view is the view of most of the Ukrainian government, and it certainly is at the moment, they will simply fight a guerrilla war. I mean, even if they didn't have Western support, they would do what they were intending probably to have to do in February last year, was to go into guerrilla war. I mean, I remember in the first days of the war, seeing Maidan Square in Kiev full of students who were sitting around filling Molotov cocktails. And that was astonishing to see all these young people preparing thousands and thousands of Molotov cocktails against Russian tanks that were coming their way. And they will go back to doing that. And so the idea that Putin somehow can, as it were, take the gains and walk away and reset his relationship with the West on that basis is fanciful. It won't happen. There's no way back for Putin. Absolutely no way back.
So is the only option then complete defeat of Vladimir Putin and removing all Russian troops from Ukraine? Because otherwise, as some analysts believe, he'll be on a path to invading more former Soviet countries. Do you agree with that?
I'm not sure Russia will be in a position to invade anybody else after this. But if the Russians are seen to succeed, in other words, if Putin walks away with what is perceived by him and by the rest of the world to be a victory or a partial victory, then the West loses very, very badly, because the dictatorships are on the march in the world. And because we've now committed ourselves to Ukraine in the way that we have over the last year, the credibility of liberal democracy is on the line, not just as an ideology, but as a power center in world politics, which it has been for the last more than 200 years. And so in a way, we are on a tiger's back now, because having committed ourselves to as we're defeating this Putin adventure, if we fail to defeat it, then the rest of the world will draw its own conclusions about the waning power of the Western world, and we'll feel the effect of that pretty strongly. And so what I would expect is that if Putin can be thrown back, not out of all of Ukraine, I mean, that would be very good if he were, but I suspect that if he were thrown back out of the Ukraine that he's conquered since 2022, I think the Western world would regard that as victory and would be happy with that. And although Ukraine wouldn't like it, if the West thought that that was probably okay, then I think Kiev would have to decide that, at least for the time being, that was okay. And then I have a very dangerous proposal to make, because the issue then is, what then for Ukraine? Does it live in a permanent state of warfare with Russia for the next 50 or 60 years, which would be the prospect? So my very dangerous proposal is that if Russia can be thrown out of the territories it's occupied since February 22, and then what's the remainder of Ukraine, which would be 92% of Ukraine, is brought into NATO and given the NATO guarantee, that would be something that the Kremlin would have to worry about. And that would actually give some reassurance to Kiev. Now, to do that, NATO would have to change its rules, bringing in less than a whole territory, bringing in a country that was officially still at war with a neighbor. That's against NATO rules. So it would have to accept that. And Kiev would have to accept that, at least for the time being, not all of the country would come into NATO. So, this is a crazy idea. But there is a certain logic to it, that if we could throw the Russians out of this imperialist adventure that we're now living through, this nightmare that Putin has put upon us, and then Ukraine, the vast majority of Ukraine, minus Crimea, came into NATO, that would change the balance of the structure of the architecture of security in Europe fundamentally, and would give us a new starting point. I don't expect politicians ever to agree to this in the present tense, but as an analyst, one has to think these things through. So I'm saying the unsayable here for the first. I've been thinking about this and talking to some friends about it on and off, but I'm saying it now to you, Kate, in public, and see what sort of reaction I get.
Professor Michael Clarke, thank you for saying the unsayable. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. See you next time.